Starting in the 19th century, Western scholars, none of them Muslim, began to apply their standard tools of critical thinking and historical research to the traditional Islamic narrative about the Prophet Muhammad, the Qur'an, and early Islamic history. Some of the issues that Western historians and philologists have raised call into question some fundamental Islamic religious beliefs. What are those beliefs? What are those questions? And how do Muslims respond to them? Let's find out. My name is Alex, and welcome to Depth History, where we talk about how the human condition created and creates the human condition. Let's begin with the standard Islamic narrative of Islam's origins, which goes something like this. In the early 600s, an illiterate merchant named Muhammad in the Arabian town of Mecca let it be known that he'd been receiving prophecies from the angel Gabriel. Over time, he gathered a group of followers, and because he spoke out against Mecca's polytheistic culture, they were forced to flee to Yathrib, today Medina, an oasis to the north, where he attracted more followers. A decade later, now calling themselves Muslims, they returned to conquer Mecca and established a new, strictly monotheistic religion, Islam, based on Muhammad's revelations, which were later recorded in Islam's holy book, the Qur'an. Muhammad united the tribes of Arabia under the banner of Islam, and within a century of his death in 632, they had conquered a vast empire, stretching from Iberia and France in the west to India and the borders of China in the east, a stunning and unprecedented conquest, which Muslims attributed to their God, to Allah. In this video, we'll be discussing one of Islam's fundamental claims, that the Quran is an exact word-for-word record of Muhammad's prophecies. The Quran was initially transmitted only orally. It was recited text, not read, because memorization was considered the best way to preserve its text and guarantee its continuity and integrity. This privileging of orality over writing was not unique to Arab culture. Plato's Socrates declared that writing produces forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory and will be for the most part ignorant and hard to get along with, since they are not wise but only appear wise. I guess he knew some writers. St. Paul wrote that the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. In Judaism too, the oral law, the Mishnah and Talmud, take precedence over, and sometimes even override, the written law, the Bible. In Hindu scripture, reliance on writing was seen as crippling and not giving true control over linguistic content. Knowledge in a book is money in another's hand. So, if the Quran was transmitted only orally, how did it come to be written down? The traditional narrative of the written Quran's history derives from hadith collections compiled in the 9th century. What is a hadith? It's a tradition of sayings, actions, and events of the lives of Muhammad and his companions that was initially transmitted orally and eventually written down, together with an isnad, a chain of transmission, a list of Muslim worthies who had passed on that tradition from the original authority. Hadiths provide authoritative guidance for Muslims on how they should speak and act. There are multiple traditions describing how the Quran came to be written down. The earliest is that of Ibn Sa'd, that the Prophet's companions collected the Quran during Muhammad's lifetime before he died in 632. Ibn Sa'd also provided another tradition, that it was the Caliph Uthman who collected the Quran during the reign of his predecessor, the Caliph Umar. Another tradition, when the Prophet Muhammad died, the Quran had not yet been written down. At the Battle of Yamama, so many Muslims who had memorized the Quran were killed that Muhammad's successor, the Caliph Abu Bakr, feared that the Quran would be forgotten. So he ordered Muhammad's secretary, Zayd ibn Thabit, to compile a complete Qur'an, telling him, "Slaughter has waxed hot among the readers of the Qur'an in the day of Yamama, and I fear that it may again wax hot among the readers in other countries as well, and that it may be lost. Now, therefore, I deem that you should give orders for the collection of the Qur'an." It turned out that some prophecies had already been written down, so Zayd collected them from palm leaves, stones, camel bones, as well as from the hearts of men. However, at this point, the Qur'an remained unpublished, kept first with Abu Bakr, and after his death with his successor, Caliph Umar, and after Umar's assassination with Umar's daughter Hafsa, who was one of Muhammad's widows. He had several. Another tradition. Umar's successor, Caliph Uthman, was told by a soldier returning from battle that different regions had different versions of the Qur'an. "O commander of the faithful," the soldier pleaded, "overtake this nation before they have discrepancies about the book, as the Jews and the Christians have." Uthman then ordered that an official standard version of the Qur'an be compiled, with the help of scrolls in Hafsa's possession, distributed throughout the Islamic Empire, and that the variant Qur'ans, the ones with different texts, be confiscated and destroyed. Another tradition. Early Shia Islam rejected all these traditions and held that it was the Caliph Ali, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, who first collected the Qur'an shortly after Muhammad's death, a tradition that also survives in some Sunni sources. These dissident Shia memories likewise bring into high relief the political and religious dynamics that were directly at work in the actions of the Sunni imperial authorities to impose a standard version of the Qur'an. Now, some modern scholars believe that it was actually the Caliph Abd al-Malik who compiled the standard Qur'an about 60 years after Muhammad's death, on the grounds that none of the previous caliphs had commanded a state apparatus powerful enough to enforce the necessary mass distribution of a standard Qur'an and the suppression of other versions. The result of these multiple standardizations was, as Muslims proudly complain, that all copies of the Qur'an in the world today are completely identical to each other and to the standard Qur'an created sometime in the 7th century. This isn't exactly 100% accurate. There are minor differences, but we'll get to them later. Historians have raised a number of problems with these traditions. It was once widely believed by memory scientists that pre-literate people have exceptional memories and can more easily memorize long texts than can literate people. But experience has repeatedly shown that oral traditions are not reliable. As an example of both oral traditions' tenacity and flexibility, we can cite the African kingdom of Ganja in what is now modern-day Gabon. Written records made by the British colonial administration in the early 20th century show that Ganja oral tradition then presented the founder of the Ganja state as having had 7 sons, each of whom was the ruler of one of the state's 7 territorial divisions. 60 years later, when the myths of the state were again recorded, 2 of the 7 divisions had disappeared, one by assimilation to another division, and the other by reason of a boundary dispute. In these later myths, the founder had had only 5 sons, and no mention was made of the 2 extinct divisions. The Ganja were still in contact with their past, tenacious about the truth of their myths, but the parts of the past that were no longer relevant had simply fallen away. The present imposed its own economy on past remembrances. The French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss and others have suggested that oral traditions reflect a society's present cultural values rather than idle curiosity about the past. Modern scientific studies of human memory have shown that our memories are surprisingly inaccurate, particularly in the absence of any written record. And at best, we can over time remember only the bare bones gist of a past event. Oral transmission is characterized by a high level of omission and alteration, and with a matter of only a few repetitions, a tradition will change significantly from the original, even if in some instances something of the original gist is maintained. Therefore, we may not simply assume that what eventually came to be written down in the Quran is identical with what Muhammad taught. How do Muslim scholars respond to this issue? Muslim scholars respond that the Quran and its perfect word-for-word preservation are cold, hard facts, miracles beyond the ability of mere mortals to understand, and Muslims must accept these facts without asking questions. Their position is best epitomized by the comment of the jurist Malik ibn Anas on the Quranic reference to God's sitting upon the throne. The sitting, he is reported to have said, is known. Its modality is unknown. Belief in it is an obligation, and raising questions regarding it is a heresy. By the way, for some people, being told what to believe and never to ask questions about it is very comforting, as it relieves them of any and all responsibility for their actions. To find out more about this way of thinking and why some people embrace it, see the video linked to above somewhere. In the 9th century, Muhammad al-Bukhari reviewed 600,000 hadiths, of which many were duplicates, and decided that only 2,230 unique hadiths were authentic, and the rest, more than 99%, were forgeries. His contemporary, Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj, is reported to have reviewed 300,000 hadiths with similar results. Since a hadith is a tradition of the sayings and actions of Muhammad and his companions, they all relate to events that occurred 2 centuries before al-Bukhari and Muslim authenticated and recorded them. How is it possible that these hadiths were accurately preserved after being transmitted orally for 2 centuries? The criteria applied by al-Bukhari and Muslim to determine which hadiths were authentic was to examine the isnad, the chain of transmitters. Only if every person in the chain was considered reliable, the hadith was considered authentic. They didn't examine the content of the hadith itself, but only asked who reported it. The authentication of hadiths was confined to a careful examination of the chain of transmitters who narrated the report, and not the report itself. Provided the chain was uninterrupted and the individual links deemed trustworthy persons, the hadith was accepted as binding law. There could, by the terms of the religious faith itself, be no questioning of the content of the report, for this was the substance of divine revelation, and therefore not susceptible to any form of legal or historical criticism. So, all the multiple different versions of how the Quran came to be written down are true, because each one is the substance of divine revelation and therefore not susceptible to any form of legal or historical criticism. Muslim scholars respond that the accurate preservation of the hadiths that al-Bukhari and Muslim deemed authentic, including the dependability of their criteria, must be accepted as facts without asking questions. Another miracle. Once again, belief in it is an obligation, and raising questions regarding it is a heresy. In 1923, only 100 years ago, Al-Azhar University in Egypt issued a new standard text of the Quran. This was needed because despite the Quran's standardization more than 1,000 years earlier, multiple versions of the Quranic text had developed, though with only minor differences among them. How did it happen that these non-standard versions spread across the Islamic world if a standard vision had already been set in stone more than 1,000 years earlier? Presumably, this was because a handwritten copy is almost never an exact copy, and copies of copies are even less faithful to the original. But in 1923, when Al-Azhar University published its standard text, the modern technology of printing had solved this problem. How do Muslim scholars respond to this issue? Muslim scholars respond that the differences between these Qur'ans are minor, a word here and there, and they don't affect the meaning. They explain these differences, one name for them is qur'an, as reflecting the various Arabic dialects, or what are called modes of recitation, fixed by various Muslim scholars between the 9th to the 15th century, and all of them are considered canonical. The fact that the first qira'at were fixed by scholars more than 2 centuries after the creation of the written Quran raises some questions. But once again, belief in it is an obligation, and raising questions regarding it is a heresy. The Arabic alphabet of the Quran is a defective script. That is, only consonants can be written with it, not vowels. Furthermore, in that alphabet, several consonants shared the same signs. The earliest written Quran manuscripts lacked the diacritical dots that were later invented to distinguish between similar consonants. So there was at first some ambiguity about what a word was. In the graphic, you can see on the left side 3 different consonants which look exactly the same. And on the right side, you can see the same consonants with the diacritical dots to distinguish them from one another. How do Muslim scholars respond to this issue? Muslim scholars respond that there is perfection and clarity in these so-called ambiguities, that sometimes all the different meanings are correct, proving once more the Quran's perfection, that there is no better way of saying what the Quran says. They add that in any case, from the very beginning, Muslims had memorized the Quran with the correct consonants and vowels, so the fact that the written text used a defective alphabet was not a problem, because there was always a nearby authority who could provide the correct reading. A few early Quran manuscripts have been preserved, and not all of them are identical to the standard Quran. Dating these manuscripts has proved difficult. The text may have been written on an older parchment, so the date of the parchment is not necessarily close to the date of the text, and using carbon-14 has not provided consistent or sufficiently accurate results. Carbon-14 dating alone, with no further evidence available, hardly yields meaningful and hard results. A single test result may prove that a document, that is the material it's written on, is medieval and not a modern forgery. Under good conditions and with careful experimental setups, we might reach a highly probable 50-year window for dating, but day-to-day business is rather the assignment of a century. This is borne out in practice, where different leaves of the same codex are dated to different 50-year windows, and the same leaf is often differently dated by different laboratories. Sometimes parchments were reused, with the earlier texts being erased. These are called palimpsests. One such palimpsest was discovered in Yemen during a 1972 restoration of the Great Mosque of Sana'a. The upper text, which you see here, is pretty much identical to the standard Quran text, but the lower text, which you can see below it, was recovered through X-ray fluorescence imaging at Stanford University, and you can see the lower text now is very different from it, and the sequence of its chapters corresponds to no known Quranic order. How do Muslim scholars respond to this issue? Muslim scholars respond that the non-standard Quran manuscripts are obviously among the variant Quran versions that were ordered to be confiscated and destroyed when the standard Quran text was established. The lower text of the Sana'a manuscript is also one of these, but instead of destroying it, the manuscript's owner erased the variant text and wrote the standard text over it. Parchments were expensive, so it's not surprising that the owner found another way to comply with the Caliph's order. If you're interested in learning more about the history of the Quran, I've included a list of some books you can read in the description below. If you'd like to learn about why the Islamic Empire, once more highly developed, more cosmopolitan, more educated, much wealthier, and militarily more powerful than the West, lost its economic and military preeminence, all because of an ivory tower dispute among its theologians, click on the link in the upper corner of the screen. Please join me in future episodes where we'll be examining in detail other problematic aspects of the standard Islamic narrative, and later individual areas like the abolition of slavery, the rise of religious skepticism and disbelief, human rights, women's rights, and others. By the way, if you enjoyed this video, please click the like icon, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll be notified of new videos as soon as they come out. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.